Rosespanner Gregor is an identity in Limbus Company. Now, his performance in-game, in general, is not the focus of this video. I don't think he's especially effective. It's more that I think that Rosespanner Greg here is an interesting case study in how individually weak game pieces can affect stronger game pieces in interesting ways, and how strategies that have a mix of weak and strong components that make them up can be just kind of fun. That story, how a weaker game piece can potentially lead to fun, begins with this attack. This is Gregor's AEDD, a tier 3 E.G.O he can equip. Welcome aboard, folks. I'm Zandy. Glad to have you with us. A lot of Limbus Company's interesting build-making decisions come from the tension between identities, the versions of each character that you equip, and the E.G.O, these special attacks they equip. And few so much, I think, as Rosespanner Gregor and AEDD. So let's look at the E.G.O first. This is a gloom attack that causes enemies to get this special status effect. It says that when you hit them, the attacker gains charge count, so one of your units gains charge count. We're not worried about that here. This could be used to support a charge-themed team, but that's not what we're doing. When hit by a gloom attack, so a teal attack of this color, you get rupture count, and then you lose a stack of this effect. So 15 times while this status effect is active, enemies do not lose rupture count when you hit them. So what you'll see is now that this enemy is debuffed with that blue static discharge status, and you can see the teal rupture stack, 13 and 3 right now, as these attacks hit, they're not going to reduce my count of that status. So rupture just does damage every time you hit the enemy equal to the first number. So I get to do that 13 damage every single time I hit the enemy without it falling off, because I have this static discharge status. It's pretty powerful. You can imagine that if I can manage to get any little amount of additional rupture, I'm just going to build more and more damage on this enemy without losing my stack. You can see here I can attack them lots of times, and I'm not losing that second number. It's 13 and 4 now, because the enemy has static discharge. I can just keep attacking them and keep cashing in my damage. Obviously, this is a very modest example, but imagine how much damage it would be if I had a good amount of rupture on this enemy. So now you have context. Rosespanner Gregor is now very simple. He's just not very good at inflicting a lot of rupture. He does have this purple envy and teal gloom affinity, which are the resources that it costs to use this E.G.O, and you do have to run Gregor as an active combatant on your team to use this E.G.O. So yeah, he kind of fuels it, and this is good. It's one hit, so you only lose one stack of rupture count, and it inflicts 2 rupture count. That's sort of good. And this attack is gloom, so it doesn't lose you stacks of rupture. Yeah, he's still pretty bad. But the thing is that for a long time, there really weren't other Gregor identities that had rupture skills. Now, you could argue it doesn't really matter. Again, this isn't a video about how Rosespanner Gregor was secretly good the whole time because he enables AEDD. I don't think that's true. The game actually launched with a Gregor rupture identity that doesn't have a gloom skill, doesn't have an envy skill. Sure, he doesn't fuel this attack, but I mean, he does technically some stuff with rupture, and a little bit more, or he at least benefits more from the enemy having rupture if you upgrade him fully. So it's not as if there were literally no other options. But I mean, if you just want strong gloom attacks, there are plenty of other good choices. I think this is an individually strong Gregor identity, for example, with a nice chunky multi-hit gloom attack. That would be pretty good with AEDD, I don't know. So no, it's more how Rosespanner Gregor and therefore AEDD kind of enable these big rupture stacks. Here you can see a more substantial one on the main target, 48 and 17, a little bit more meaningful amount of rupture. Your rupture is a very direct status effect. You just directly do damage equal to the first number, the number of times equal to the second number that you have stacks. And so it's normally hard to enable, and that's pretty reasonable. Building a team with a lot of gloom attacks to use, and all those periphery elements, you could say this sounds like it's a lot about AEDD, but what I think is interesting is how that was, for some time in Limbus Company's lifespan, relatively hard to do. I mean, Rosespanner Gregor is not a particularly strong option for these teams, but he was sort of the only game in town for a while. And you can see some of these units are doing a great job, but certainly making sure that you have a lot of those gloom skills lined up and just kind of being willing to use whatever units are available that have gloom attacks and making the most of them when they come up. It is an interesting gameplay loop, and it is partly more interesting because some of those units are not that strong, because Rosespanner Gregor is not that strong, and yet you kind of have to use some Gregor identity. It's not even to get into other interesting aspects of his design. Rosespanner Gregor has that little splash of tremor we saw when we were looking at him before. I did try running some mix of tremor and rupture teams. There's a surprising amount of support for that in the game on paper. I don't think it's all that strong in practice, but you know. So this is a weird gameplay gems episode. Like, Rosespanner Gregor arguably didn't add any of this to most players' experiences of Limbus Company. Most of this has been about AEDD and how Rosespanner Gregor, you know, arguably doesn't do a lot of these things, even though there's some interesting stuff going on paper. But I made this anyway for two main reasons. First of all, that subjectivity is kinda always there. Just because I, or most players, or whoever and however many people, appreciate a piece of design in a game's build system doesn't mean it is there in some elemental way we can prove, or there's no point in proving such a thing. This series is partly about highlighting the suggestions the games present to the player. And yes, I do try to lean into somewhat less faint suggestions, stuff in games that feels more clearly a part of those games. But I think Rosespanner Gregor was pretty clearly intended to be interesting in these ways I've described, even though perhaps he wasn't for most players. And I personally did insist on using him with AEDD and my rupture teams for a long while. So the fact that he wasn't, like mechanically really strong? I mean, I cleared all the content in the game during the time I was doing this with him. I'm not arguing that I'm right or anything, that doesn't matter. Just to say I do think it's always a gray area. And one of the things I like doing with gameplay gems is leaning into the game design perspective of these game pieces. A heuristic, or sort of mental summary tool I like to use when I try to consider games more objectively, is that the game is the behavior the game rewards. Merely being able to do something in a game doesn't make the game about that in an especially meaningful way. It is what the game emphasizes somehow. That is what it is about. Part of game design is steering the player toward the things that the game is trying to be about. But even using that heuristic, it is still pretty subjective most of the time what is part of the game, what the game is about. And I think that's an accurate representation of many games with build systems and the way that we play with build systems. In this case, while initially I'd think of using Rosespanner Gregor this way as just more my own affectation and not especially part of the game experience, I do think that by having difficulty flexible enough to allow this janky Rosespanner Gregor situation to work, and by designing statuses in that way where they've got two components, so it's quite hard compared to other games to stack up a lot of a status, we do see Limbus Company being a little bit about using units and E.G.O like this, and making compromises in power to stack things up. At least I think it was like that for a time. You could interpret it as being more about how strong other rupture units or Greg's AEDD E.G.O are, but in any case, I do think that is part of the game in some meaningful way, even if it doesn't happen to be an experience a lot of players had. The second reason I made this gameplay gem is very simple. I do think this is a charming design idea. This isn't a series about powerful game pieces, it's just that elegant design often does result in relative power, because it'll be useful in a crisp and effective or janky but potent way. Rosespanner Gregor here is just, to me, a relatively rare example of a design idea that I think is pretty solid and could have been fun, but just happened not to be in practice, or he was just weak enough in many cases that won't have felt worth it to many people. Even having used him a lot, I don't think I would agree that he feels worth it, if you will. But just that this is a design that I think still holds water on paper, even though in practice the exact implementation didn't fully work. You could say maybe it's just kind of rare for developers to have ideas that potentially elegant, but then implement them relatively poorly or in a janky way. That just maybe doesn't happen that often. But I think in this case it did. I think it's still a good design idea. It's just not actually that good in practice. The idea of having an identity that kind of dips into multiple status effects, but then is weak enough in each of them, while having strong enablers for some of them, that you get a kind of balanced environment. For example, some of this is enabling Tremor, and Ledgermain, another powerful Gregor E.G.O, does have powerful Tremor support as well. So you can see what they were trying to do, right? Like, you get a little splash of both kinds. There is a variety of support in the game, though I also think much of it is not very powerful, for Tremor and Rupture teams, and then Gregor has two E.G.O that kind of beef that up. I think they pretty clearly were intending this to be a reasonable trade-off. I just think it kind of isn't in practice. So folks, this time I propose to you a gameplay gem. Rosespanner Gregor? Maybe AEDD gets some of the credit too? What do you think? Is this suitably a gameplay gem to you? It's the nature of Limbus Company's gameplay, where you'd often play with a whole team, that Rosespanner Gregor's attacks barely feature in most of this footage, and what could be a better summary of this situation in this episode? I've been Zandy, and you've been tuned into Gameplay Gems. Hope you enjoyed. Where are we off to next?